He lived alone, hardened by the Wild West. Then, at a dusty auction, he bought a woman no one wanted. What happened next? It shattered his world and changed everything. Where are you watching from? Tell us below, and if you want more gripping stories, hit subscribe. Now get ready. This story is about to take you deep into the heart of the frontier. I remember the heat of that afternoon more than anything else. It clung to my skin like a curse, heavy and suffocating, turning every breath into an effort. The dust from the unpaved road hung in the air, refusing to settle, and my shirt stuck to my back with sweat. I never liked crowds, and I liked auctions even less, but there I was, standing apart from the rest, staring at the rough, wooden platform in front of the old warehouse where Silas ran his trade. The town of Dry Hollow wasn't much to look at. A scattering of tired storefronts, the clink of a distant blacksmith hammer, and faces carved by sun and disappointment. I'd come for practical resents, a new plow blade, maybe a sack of seed before the prices climbed higher, but the day had other plans. I'm not a man prone to impulse. My life on the Broken Mesa Ranch had been shaped by discipline, silence, and the slow erosion of hope. Yet in that moment, under that damned heat, something shifted. They brought her out, wrapped head to toe in coarse burlap, like a sack of grain someone was ashamed to show. I couldn't see her face. Hell, I couldn't even tell if she was young or old, strong or frail. Silas's voice cut through the murmurs. Indentured servant. Passage debt to clear. Young, healthy, willing. His words felt oily, like snake oil he'd sell to the desperate. Around me, men shifted their weight, some with mild curiosity, others with cold calculation. I should have looked away, should have walked back to my wagon, left the crowd and the guilt behind. But I didn't. I watched her stand there, shoulders hunched, head down, small even under the rough cloth, vulnerable. And in a town like this, vulnerability drew either pity or hunger. Without thinking, my hand rose. $50. I heard myself say, my voice rougher than usual. A few heads turned. Silas blinked, then grinned like a wolf. Bidding started, half-hearted and slow, more out of habit than desire. But each time someone raised, I raised higher. I can't explain why. There was no logic to it, just an ache in my chest that tightened each time I thought of someone else taking her. When the gavel slammed, Silas barked, "Sold to Mr. Everett Cole." And just like that, it was over. The crowd melted away, whispers trailing behind them like dust. I stood there, feeling the weight of what I'd done. $50 would have been fair. I'd gone to 90. Far too much for a debt servant, even a healthy one. But it wasn't about the money anymore. She didn't lift her head, didn't speak, just stood there, wrapped and silent, as if bracing for whatever came next. I told her, "Come on," my words clumsy on my tongue. I led her to the wagon, conscious of every pair of eyes on us, the judgment heavy as iron. We didn't speak on the ride back. The road stretched long and lonely, framed by brittle sagebrush and the bleached bones of fallen cattle. The land itself felt ancient, scarred by years of drought and wind. I'd built my life out there on the Broken Mesa Ranch, miles from anyone, because solitude was safer than hope. Or so I thought. She sat in the back, burlap still hiding her face. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder. She barely moved, only shifting when the wagon lurched over a rut. I wondered if she was crying under that cloth, or praying, or cursing the man who'd bought her. I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. The ranch came into view as the sun dipped low, turning the world copper and gold. A single cabin, worn but solid, a corral with 2 tired horses, and a stretch of hard land I'd carved into stubborn survival. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And now, somehow, it was hers too. I showed her the spare room, plain walls, a narrow cot, and a wash basin. "Water's there," I muttered. "Clothes on the chair. Food's in the kitchen when you're ready." My words scraped out like gravel, and I turned to leave, craving the silence of the porch, the comfort of the coming night. But just as I reached the door, her voice soft, fragile, slipped out. "Everett?" My name, spoken like a question and a promise all at once. I froze, turned back. Her hand rose, trembling, and slowly she pulled the burlap free. What I saw wasn't what I'd braced myself for. No bruises, no scars that spoke of cruelty. Instead, a young woman, her face smudged with dust, eyes the color of storm-tossed seas. Fear, yes, but also something else. Strength, defiance. I heard them call your name, she whispered, before they covered me. You were the only one who didn't look away. In that moment, something inside me cracked. Years of loneliness, grief, and the hard shell I'd built around my heart shifted just a little. I nodded, words stuck in my throat. She lowered her gaze, and silence settled between us again. But it was different this time, less like a wall, more like a space waiting to be filled. The days that followed felt like walking across thin ice, quiet, brittle, and filled with things unsaid. She spoke little, almost nothing at all, and when she did, her voice came out small and raw, like it hadn't been used in too long. I'd catch glimpses of her when she thought I wasn't looking, her eyes tracing the cracks in the floorboards, her fingers worrying the hem of her borrowed dress, shoulders tight as if waiting for a blow that never came. At first I tried to keep my distance. The truth is I didn't know what to do with another soul in my space. My days had been shaped by silence and routine. Dawn chores, the endless grind of tending cattle, patching fences, keeping the roof from caving under the weight of time. Solitude had become a comfort, a shield against memories I'd rather keep buried. Yet every time I stepped into the cabin and saw her there, a strange unease stirred inside me, like standing too close to a fire after years of cold. She barely ate at first, picking at the stew I set before her. At night, I'd hear the faint rustle of blankets from her room, restless movements that spoke of nightmares or memories that wouldn't let her sleep. I wanted to ask her name, but the words caught in my throat. It felt wrong to ask something so personal when I'd bought her freedom, or rather her debt. The truth sat heavy in my chest. I'd paid money, and she'd ended up here. No matter what good intentions I told myself I had, the facts didn't change. And that truth echoed in the way she kept her eyes down, as if expecting me to call in my right at any moment. But I couldn't. Instead, I did the only thing I knew. I worked. From dawn till the light faded, my hands stayed busy mending tack, hauling water, chopping wood. Yet each motion felt oddly different, as if I wasn't just working for myself anymore. She began to move around the cabin, tentative at first, like a stray animal testing the edges of a new cage. One morning, I found she'd swept the floor before I was even awake, the scent of fresh bread hanging in the air. The loaf was small, burned at the edges, but to me it tasted better than anything I'd had in years. We settled into a rhythm of almost wordless cooperation. I'd bring in firewood, she'd stack it by the stove, she'd scrub the kettle, I'd patch a leaking plank in the roof. Each task was simple, yet layered with meaning neither of us dared speak aloud. Nights were the hardest. The silence pressed down heavy, thick with everything left unsaid. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch, nursing a tin cup of coffee gone cold, and watch the moon spill silver over the dry plains. Inside, I could hear her breathing, soft but unmistakable, living human sound that made the walls feel less empty. One evening, after a day spent fixing fence posts out on the southern pasture, I stepped inside to find her near the window, staring out at the horizon. The light caught her hair, and for a breath, she looked like she belonged there, part of the land itself, carved by wind and sun. She turned when she noticed me, startled, and her eyes dropped. The moment broke like glass. I cleared my throat, the words rough and unfamiliar. "You don't have to hide," I managed to say. "Not from me." She nodded but didn't answer. Instead, she went to the table, her hands trembling as she ladled soup into a bowl. Watching her, I realized how little I knew of her life before Dry Hollow. What roads had brought her to that platform? What kindnesses had she known, if any? Guilt gnawed at me. Not because I'd taken her in, but because part of me was glad she was here. After so many years of empty rooms and echoing footsteps, her presence, even silent, filled a space I hadn't realized was hollow. In the quiet moments, I caught myself wondering about her voice, show it would sound if she laughed or cursed or called my name without fear. And I hated myself a little for wanting that, knowing what had brought her here wasn't choice but desperation. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I could hear her faint breathing through the thin wall. I tried to picture the lines of her face in the dark, to hold on to something real beyond guilt and longing. And for the first time in years, I prayed. Not to own her, not for gratitude or love returned, but simply that she might find some small measure of peace under my roof. The next morning, when I stepped into the kitchen, she lifted her gaze just long enough for our eyes to meet. Just a flicker, a second, no more. But it felt like a crack in the ice. A beginning. Days bled into each other on the broken mesa ranch, measured not by clocks but by the sun's climb and fall, the creak of saddle leather, the scrape of a hoe in dry soil. It had always been that way for me until her presence began to mark time in quieter, stranger ways. I noticed it in small things first, how she'd pause on the porch at dawn, her eyes following the light spilling over the hills, how she'd tilt her head slightly when the wind shifted, catching scents I'd long stopped noticing. There was something almost fierce in that quiet attention, as if each breath she took was a promise to stay alive, to keep going despite everything that had brought her here. We still spoke little, but the silence grew softer around the edges, less like stone walls, more like worn pathways where words might someday travel. When I brought back supplies from town, she'd meet my eyes for a heartbeat before turning away. When we shared a meal, her shoulders sat a fraction lower, the tension easing just enough to notice. One evening, I came in from the corral to find her at the stove, brow furrowed in concentration, trying to coax the stubborn fire into life. Her hands, once small and pale, were beginning to show the first hints of calluses marks of the same land that had shaped me. Without thinking, I moved beside her, crouching to stack the wood differently, cupping my hands to shelter the flickering spark. The heat flared between us, painting her face in gold and shadow. For a moment, neither of us moved. The cabin felt smaller, the air thick with something unspoken. Then she stepped back, a whisper of space restored, and the moment passed. But it left an imprint on my chest, like a brand still glowing. That night, I lay awake replaying it, my mind restless. I tried to tell myself it meant nothing, just the ordinary clumsiness of sharing a small space, but the truth pressed closer. It had meant something, to me at least. One morning, as we prepared to ride out and check the northern fence line, I finally found the nerve to ask, "What should I call you?" She paused, her hand frozen over the saddle horn. Then, in a voice rough with disuse, but stronger than I'd heard before, she said, "Clara." Clara. The name settled into my mind like a stone in still water, sending ripples I couldn't quite name. It felt right, plain yet graceful, sturdy yet soft. I nodded, the word catching in my mouth before I managed, "All right, Clara then." She didn't smile exactly, but something around her eyes eased. We rode out together, the rhythm of hoofbeats filling the gaps where words might have been. The fence was in worse shape than I'd feared. Wind and neglect had taken their toll. As I lifted the rails and hammered new posts, she moved beside me, steadying planks, handing me nails without needing to be asked. Watching her work, sweat darkening her dress, hair clinging to her temples, I felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Pride at her quiet resolve. Sorrow that life had demanded such hardness from someone so young. As the sun dipped low, we rested under the scant shade of a lone cottonwood. I offered her my canteen, and for the first time, she took it without hesitation. After a long swallow, she spoke, her voice low but certain. "I wasn't always afraid, you know." The words surprised me, cutting through the hush of wind and dry grass. I waited, not wanting to break the fragile bridge she'd laid out between us. "My father taught me to ride," she continued, gaze fixed on the horizon. "Taught me to hold a rifle steady. Told me the land gives nothing, so you take what you need and give back what you can." Her voice faltered, but only for a breath. Then fever took him, and my mother, 2 weeks later. After that, there was no one left to remember who I was before fear. I swallowed hard, the taste of dust and memories sharp on my tongue. I'm sorry, I rasped, though the words felt small, too thin to cover so much loss. She nodded, her eyes distant. I don't tell you because I want pity, she said. I tell you because I think you might understand. And God help me, I did. My own ghost stirred at the edges of her story, my mother's gentle laugh fading to silence, my father's rough hands stilling in death, the crushing quiet of a house that had never felt empty until it was. We rode back as the stars began to bloom in the darkening sky, the silence between us changeless and emptiness, more a shared space where grief could rest without shame. That night, as I sat on the porch, Clara stepped out and stood beside me. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Just breathing, the same cool air felt like confession enough. Somewhere in the hush between heartbeat and breath, I realized something had shifted. She was no longer just the woman I'd brought from town. Clara had become a part of the ranch's quiet rhythm, a thread woven through my days. And though neither of us dared name it, a fragile hope had taken root between us, small, stubborn, and alive. The days grew shorter as autumn crept across the plains, its breath turning the mornings crisp and laying a silver sheen of frost over the fields. The changing season brought a hush to the land, a hush that seemed to mirror what was happening between Clara and me. Something had shifted after that day under the cottonwood. We didn't speak of it, not directly, but in small gestures, in the silences we shared without flinching, the change was as real as the coming cold. She began to ask quiet questions about the ranch, which pasture needed the most care, where the soil held water longest after rain. At first, my answers were brief, cautious, but over time, words came easier, and I found myself telling her about the stubborn heifer that always broke fences, the winter flood that had nearly drowned my first herd, the season when the well had gone dry and I'd nearly given up. She listened not with polite distance, but with a focus that felt like standing in sunlight after years of shade. Sometimes, after I spoke, she'd nod slowly, as though weighing each word against something inside her. One chilly morning, as I was hitching the team to the wagon, I caught her watching me. Her gaze didn't drop when I looked back. Instead, after a moment, she spoke. You said once you understand, she murmured. What did you mean? The question hung between us, raw and sharp. I tightened the last strap, my fingers stiff in the cold, and took a breath that felt too big for my chest. My family, I said, the words tasting of old sorrow. They're gone. Fever too, years back. Just me left, and this place. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her eyes clear, steady, told me she understood better than any words could. That night, after supper, we found ourselves sitting by the hearth. The fire cracked softly, painting her face in restless shadows. For the first time, I spoke of things I'd buried deep, my mother's gentle songs in the evenings, my father's laughter that grew rare as droughts returned year after year. The day I buried them both, and the silence that settled into the walls of this cabin, thicker than dust. I hadn't planned to say so much, but once the words began, they spilled out, clumsy and uneven, like water bursting through a cracked dam. When I stopped, the room felt strangely lighter, though my chest still ached. Clara's gaze didn't waver. Thank you, she said softly. Just 2 words, but they held a weight I couldn't name. Her turn came slowly, over days, like dawn creeping over the horizon. She spoke of Kentucky fields that had once seemed endless, her mother's stories told by lamplight, the brittle hope that had carried them west, the sickness that stole her parents, leaving her staring at 2 fresh graves on a ridge above a dying farm. The men who came after, with ledgers and hard eyes, demanding payment she couldn't give. She told it plain, without asking for pity, just laying down the bones of her story beside mine, as if to see if they fit together. And somehow, they did. We didn't always speak directly of grief. Sometimes, as we worked side by side mending a fence, stacking firewood, repairing a broken shutter, or silences felt fuller than words. Grief, I learned, doesn't vanish. It settles into the rhythm of your days, becoming part of the air you breathe. One morning, frost white on the corral rails, I found Clara in the small patch of garden behind the cabin. Summer's blooms were long gone, but she crouched there anyway, fingers brushing dead stalks as if remembering what had grown. "I know it won't last the winter," she said when she noticed me, "but I keep hoping something might come back in spring." I wanted to tell her that hope is a dangerous thing out here, that the land takes more than it gives, but the words stuck. Instead, I only nodded, because I understood the need to hope, even when the soil seemed barren. At night, the wind began to howl through the chinks in the cabin walls, carrying the scent of distant snow. We moved closer to the hearth, the space between us shrinking. Once, as I reached to stir the embers, my hand brushed hers. She didn't flinch, and neither did I. In those quiet, flickering moments, something wordless grew, a knowing, a recognition that the wounds we carried weren't barriers, but bridges paths leading slowly and painfully toward each other. We spoke of small things too, how the coyote's call carried farther on cold nights, how the taste of coffee changed when the water came from the north spring instead of the well. Little by little, the cabin that had felt like a tomb began to feel not quite like a home, but something close. Sometimes, after she'd gone to bed, I'd sit a while longer, staring into the dying fire. And in that quiet, I'd let myself wonder, what would it mean to want her not because of debt or pity, but because of who she was becoming to me? The thought scared me, but it also warmed something deep inside I'd thought long dead. As autumn burned itself into winter, I realized the ranch was still mine, but my days, they were no longer mine alone. Winter didn't so much arrive as it ambushed, ushowling down from the northern hills with a fury that rattled windows and buried the pastures in white. The first real storm rolled in heavy and fast, turning the plains into a frozen ocean where fences vanished under drifts and cattle bunched tight against the wind. We'd prepared as best we could, chopped extra firewood, patched gaps in the barn walls, salted the trail to the well, but the prairie laughs at plans. No matter how hard you brace yourself, winter here always finds a way to break through. The morning after the first blizzard, I saddled up to check the southern herd. Clara stood in the doorway, shawl wrapped tight, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Our eyes met just for a moment and I saw worry flicker across her face. "I'll be back by sundown," I told her, though both of us knew out here that was a promise made on shifting ground. Snow lay knee-deep in the gullies, crusted with ice that cracked under the mare's hooves. The cold cut through my coat, sinking into bone. But it wasn't the cold that gnawed at meat, was the thought of leaving Clara alone, even for a day. Hours later, as pale sunlight bled across the drifts, I found the herd scattered near Dead Man's Ridge, nostrils steaming, eyes wide with cold panic. A section of fence had collapsed under the weight of snow, and several head had broken through, wandering dangerously close to the frozen creek. Cursing under my breath, I worked to drive them back, my shouts ripped away by the wind. It was slow, bone-tiring workus breaking underfoot, frost stiffening the reins. By the time I'd patched the fence with what I could carry, the sky had begun to bruise purple with dusk. I turned homeward, snow clinging to my coat, fingers numb past pain. The cabin windows glowed faintly in the distance, a warm promise against the dark. Inside, Clara had kept the fire blazing. The scent of stew hung in the air, and for the first time in years, stepping over that threshold felt like coming home rather than entering a tomb. She glanced up, relief softening her features. "You're late," she murmured, voice low but edged with something that felt almost like reproach and something else too, care. Fence came down. I rasped, stripping off my wet coat. "Cattle nearly scattered to the creek. You should eat," she said, pressing a steaming bowl into my hands before I could argue. My fingers trembled around the rough ceramic, the heat biting into frozen skin. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then quietly she added, "I kept hoping you'd come back." The words settled into me heavier than any snowfall. I met her gaze across the narrow table, the space between us smaller than it had ever felt. And I kept thinking about getting back. I admitted, surprising even myself with the honesty. Outside, the wind keened through the eaves. Inside, something softer stirred between USA's silent acknowledgement of what neither of us dared yet name. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of hardship and shared endurance. We hauled water from the half-frozen well, our breath rising in white plumes. We shoveled paths through drifts taller than Clara's shoulders. We worked side by side in the barn, rubbing warmth into the calves' slick hides to keep them alive through the nights. One evening, as I was splitting kindling by lantern light, the blade slipped and bit deep into my palm. Blood welled up, dark and hot against the cold air. Clara was there in an instant, pressing a rag to the wound, her brow drawn tight. "Let me," she whispered, guiding me to the chair by the fire. Her fingers worked quickly, cleaning and binding the cut with surprising skill. "It's nothing," I muttered, though the sting made my breath catch. Her gaze lifted to meet mine, fierce and unflinching. "Don't say that," she said. "Not to me." For a heartbeat, neither of us looked away, and in that silence something passed between Azro and undeniable. A shared understanding that this wasn't just about tending wounds or fixing fences. It was about holding each other together in a world that had done its best to break us. Later that night, I lay awake listening to the wind, the ache in my hand, a reminder of her touch. And for the first time in years, the thought of tomorrow didn't feel quite so heavy. Winter wore on, each day a test of patience and endurance. Yet beneath the cold and struggle, something quietly took root: trust. Trust that when the snow fell, we'd clear it together, that when the well froze, we'd break the ice side by side, that neither of us, no matter how dark the night, would face the morning alone. And in that trust, I felt the first stirrings of something deeper, a feeling I'd thought buried for good under years of solitude and frost. Hope. The world beyond the ranch had vanished under snow and silence. Days began and ended in a swirl of white, the horizon erased by drifting ice. And in that sealed-off world, Clara and I found a strange, quiet rhythm, fragile dance of small kindnesses and shared burdens. Each morning before dawn, I'd find her by the stove, coaxing life into the fire. The soft light would catch in her hair, turning it to molten copper for a moment before the day began. Sometimes I'd linger at the door just to watch her work, though I'd never admit it aloud. After breakfast, we'd step into the cold together. Side by side, we'd check the cattle, break the ice in the water troughs, and shovel paths through drifts that seemed to reform the moment we turned our backs. At first, our conversations were spare and practical talk of weather, feed, fence lines, but slowly, almost without realizing, other words crept in. Small memories, idle observations, questions asked not out of necessity, but out of genuine curiosity. She'd speak of her mother's bread, how it tasted sweet even without sugar, of nights spent under Kentucky stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. And I'd share stories of this land before it had a name on a map, when my father had brought me here, promising it could be a home. Once, as we worked the frozen pump, I caught her looking at Menna, just glancing but really looking. Her gaze held something searching, something vulnerable that made my chest tighten. "What is it?" I asked, my breath hanging between us like a question I was half afraid to answer. She hesitated. Then, so softly it was almost lost in the wind, she said, "You smile more now." The words struck deeper than they should have. I hadn't realized how rarely I'd smiled in those years before her, or how natural it felt now, in moments when our eyes met, or when her laughter, quiet but real, broke the silence of the cabin. That night, as I lay staring at the ceiling beams, her words echoed in my mind. "You smile more now." It wasn't just the ranch that had changed, it was me. Winter is a cruel teacher, and its tests came often. A calf born too early, its body trembling and slick with frost. A gale that ripped shingles from the cabin roof, letting snow drift into corners where even the fire's warmth couldn't reach. In those moments we moved without thinking, her hands and mine working together, each knowing what the other needed before it was asked. And afterward, when the danger had passed and the cabin stood quiet once more, we'd share a silence that wasn't emptiness, but a testament to what we'd faced together. One evening, after patching the roof and biting wind, we stood on the porch, watching dusk settle over the white fields. Clara hugged her shawl closer, breath clouding in the cold. Without thinking, I shrugged off my coat and draped it over her shoulders. She stiffened at first, surprised, then her eyes lifted to meet mine, and something unspoken passed between us. Gratitude, yes, but something softer too. Something like trust, like the quiet beginnings of belonging. She kept my coat on all through supper, and later folded it carefully by her bed. In the quiet hours, I found my thoughts turning to her more than to the ranch or the endless list of tasks waiting each morning. I'd catch myself remembering the curve of her smile, the way her eyes darkened when she was thinking, or the gentle grace of her hands as they stitched, mended, worked. These thoughts frightened me almost as much as they warmed me, because wanting her meant risking a part of myself I'd kept buried for so long it felt like it belonged to someone else. One night, the wind howling so fiercely it shook the shutters, Clara appeared at the doorway to my room. She held a candle, the light trembling with her hand. "Can I sit?" she asked, her voice barely rising above the storm. I nodded, words failing me. She perched on the edge of the chair, candle set between us on the table. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The wind rattled the walls, but in that small circle of light, it felt as if we were alone in the world. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "I still dream of Kentucky sometimes, of my mother's voice. I wake, and for a moment, I forget where I am." I swallowed, the ache in her words twisting something deep inside me. "I do too," I admitted. "Dream of before." She looked up then, and our eyes locked. "Does it ever stop hurting?" she asked. I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "But it changes, becomes part of who you are. And sometimes it hurts less when someone else knows." A silence settled then, heavy but not cruel. The kind of silence that felt like an answer in itself. Before she left, she reached out, her fingers brushing mine. Just a touch, fleeting and uncertain. But it felt as if something had cracked open between you, something raw, real, and undeniable. That night, long after she'd gone, I lay awake listening to the wind, and for the first time, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, this life didn't have to be lived alone. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, something fragile had begun to bloom. Winter's iron grip tightened around the ranch as the days grew shorter and the nights stretched on like dark rivers with no end in sight. Snowdrifts swallowed fence posts, and the wind carved hollows into the land that seemed to whisper secrets only the prairie knew. Each dawn brought a new battle. Frozen troughs, drifting paths erased overnight, cattle huddled close to the barn with frost clinging to their hides. Yet in the heart of that relentless cold, something warmer took shape, a quiet, undeniable closeness between Clara and me. It wasn't spoken outright, but it lived in the way our eyes met across the table, the way our steps fell in rhythm as we crossed the yard, the way our silences no longer felt empty but full of something unspoken. One morning, the storm had raged so fiercely through the night that the barn doors were nearly buried. I rose before first light to clear a path, expecting to do it alone as I always had. But when I stepped outside, there she was, all wrapped tight, shovel in hand, breath clouding the air. "You should be inside," I protested, though my words lacked conviction. "So should you," she answered simply. For a moment I just stood there, snowflakes settling in my beard, watching her. Then I stepped beside her, and together we carved a narrow trail through the drifts, our breath mingling in the frozen dawn. That day, the cold bit deeper than usual. My hands went numb even through thick gloves, and more than once, the wind nearly knocked me off balance. Yet beside me, Clara worked silently, stubbornly, refusing to yield. When the snow finally eased near dusk, We stood in the yard, exhausted and breathless. The world around us softened under its heavy white shroud. She turned to me then, cheeks flushed from cold, strands of hair escaping her scarf, and without thinking I reached out and brushed a snowflake from her brow. Her breath caught, and for a heartbeat the air between us felt charged, almost fragile. "I'm glad you were here," I murmured. She didn't speak, but her eyes said enough. That night, as we thawed by the hearth, I watched her fingers mending a torn sleeve. The firelight danced in her hair, and I found myself wondering how it might feel to thread my fingers through it or hold her close, not because she was here, but because she belonged here. And that thought, both comforting and terrifying, stayed with me long after we'd said goodnight. The days blurred together in a hard rhythm of snow and wind, ice and silence, yet even the harshest mornings felt softer when shared. Over time, Clara learned the land's language, the way crows gathered before a storm, how the snow crusted differently when warm weather threatened, the brittle crack of frozen earth under hooves. One evening, as the wind rattled loose shingles on the roof, I told her about the ridge north of the creek, how my father had once dreamed of planting an orchard there, believing fruit trees could tame this wild land. "And did they?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "They died the first winter. The ground was too stubborn, too dry." She was silent a moment, then said almost to herself, "Some things still take root, even where they shouldn't." Her words struck deeper than I let on. Not long after, the first real crisis came. A young steer, half starved from the cold, collapsed in the lower pasture, legs shaking too weak to rise. By the time we reached it, the sun was sinking, painting the snow in bruised shades of purple and blue. "We can't leave him," I said. Clara nodded, no hesitation in her gaze. Together, we hauled ropes around its chest and hindquarters, coaxing, lifting, pulling until my back burned and breath tore from my chest in ragged clouds. The wind cut like knives, and ice crept under my collar. At last, the steer stumbled to its feet, swaying unsteadily. Clara stood beside it, hand resting on its flank, whispering something too soft for me to hear. And for a moment in that dying light, she looked almost like part of this land, weathered but unbowed. Back in the cabin, I poured hot water for her chilled hands. As steam rose, I dared to cover her fingers with mine, rough and scarred as they were. "They're freezing," I murmured, voice hoarse. "So are yours," she whispered back. For a breathless moment, we stayed like faith hands entwined over rising steam, the world beyond the cabin walls forgotten. Later, lying awake, I realized how quietly she'd become part of my every thought. When I measured feed, I thought of her appetite. When I chopped wood, I imagined her by the fire. When I watched the snowfall, I wondered if she watched too. It scared me, but it also made me feel alive in a way I hadn't since before loss had carved hollows in my heart. One night, unable to sleep, I stepped outside. The sky was a black canvas, thick with stars. Snow glinted under moonlight, and in the stillness, I heard the cabin door open behind me. She joined me without a word, standing so close our shoulders brushed. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you," I found myself saying, the words escaping before caution could cage them. She turned, eyes wid not with fear, but with something that made my chest ache. Then she smiled, small and real. "I'm glad I'm here," she said. "So am I whispered back. In that frozen night, the air seemed to shimmer between us, not just from cold, but from something fragile, precious, and real. And though the winter still held us tight for the first time, it felt like the season was giving as much as it took. By the time the snow began to loosen its grip on the land, something had shifted between Clara and me, something so real it hung in the air like wood smoke, impossible to ignore. Winter had scoured the plains raw, but it had also scoured us. And in the stillness that followed the last storm, what remained felt honest in a way words could never fully name. The first true thaw came quietly. One morning, the snow around the barn doors turned to slush underfoot, and rivulets of meltwater traced narrow paths through the yard. The sun, pale and cautious, showed itself above the ridgeline for more than an hour, and the earth hard and frozen for so long began to breathe again. We worked side by side that day, hauling soggy bales, checking fence lines newly revealed from under months of white. Mud sucked at our boots, and the air smelled of wet earth, a smell so sharp with promise it hurt. At midday, we paused by the creek, now running free again, its voice loud in the quiet. Clara knelt, dipped her fingers in the icy water, and smiled. It was a small thing, a simple, wordless joy, but seeing it sent something warm spiraling through my chest. "I miss this sound," she murmured. "Me too," I admitted. And though I meant the creek, I knew part of me meant her voice too. In those weeks of thaw, everything felt fragile, as if the slightest misstep could send us back into silence. Yet somehow, each day drew us closer. One evening, I found her in the small patch of ground beside the cabin, where the snow had finally receded. She was on her knees, turning the soil with careful hands. "Too early to plant," I warned gently. "I know," she replied without looking up, "but I wanted to see if anything lived underneath." There was something in her words I hope I recognized, because it had quietly taken root in me too. Later, as dusk settled and the sky burned orange and rose, we stood at the fence, watching the cattle. Without thinking, my hand brushed hers on the rail. She didn't pull away. Slowly, deliberately, I let my fingers lace with hers. Her skin was cool from the evening air, but her grip was warm and sure. For a long moment, we stayed like that, silent, the weight of what had grown between us pressing gentle and undeniable. She turned to me then, eyes darker in the twilight. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Regret what?" "Buying me." The question struck deep. For a moment, I couldn't speak, the truth raw in my throat. Finally, I managed. "Every day I regret how it happened, but not that it did." Her breath caught, and in her eyes I saw something like relief and something deeper too. Spring crept in slowly, the thaw revealing what winter had hidden. The cabin felt different now, less like a shelter against the cold, more like a place we belonged to together. Meals became shared rituals, not just survival. At night, the silence between us softened, filled with quiet conversation about small things. The stubborn calf who kept escaping the pen, the way the creek carved new channels through the pasture, how the wind smelled different after rain. And in those conversations, pieces of her past emerged, not in confessions but in gentle admissions offered like trust. She told me about the quilt her mother had sewn from scraps of old dresses, each patch of memory stitched into cloth, about the fire that had taken the barn back in Kentucky, and how she'd watched helpless from the porch as everything familiar burned. I listened, not out of duty, but out of something deeper, the need to know her, truly, beyond the woman I'd first seen shrouded in burlap. In return, I spoke of my own ghosts, of my father's quiet strength and my mother's laugh, long faded from memory but never truly gone, of the night fever took them both, leaving me alone with the land and my silence. She listened the way I did, fully, without interruption, without judgment. One rainy afternoon, as we repaired a section of fence warped by frost, a sudden gust caught her hair, sweeping it across her face. Without thinking, I reached out, tucking it behind her ear. My hand lingered, fingertips brushing her cheek. She turned into the touch, eyes closing for just a breath, and in that brief moment, every unspoken feeling between us felt as real as the earth beneath our boots. When her eyes opened, they met mine, and though neither of us spoke, the silence was louder than words. That night, by the hearth, I caught her watching me. The firelight danced in her eyes, and when I held her gaze, she didn't look away. Slowly, carefully, I reached for her hand. She let me, her fingers trembling just slightly in mine. "I'm not good with words," I murmured, my voice low. "You don't need them," she whispered back. For a heartbeat, I considered crossing the small space between us, drawing her close. But something in her gaze, tender but uncertain, held me back. Not out of fear, but respect, because what was growing between us deserved patience, not haste. And so we sat there, hand in hand, the fire crackling between us, the rest of the world fading beyond the cabin walls. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet earth and new grass. Inside, something softer bloomed, the fragile beginnings of love, built not on grand gestures, but on shared silences, quiet kindnesses, and the simple, stubborn act of staying. Spring had come, and with it, for the first time in years, I felt not just alive, but alive with someone else. By the time the last of the snow melted from the northern ridge, life on the ranch had taken on a rhythm that felt almost natural, almost as if it had always been this way. And yet, beneath the steady beat of chores and quiet meals, something deeper pulsed, a closeness that no longer needed to hide behind silence. The first true days of spring arrived with a softness that felt like forgiveness. The creek, swollen from meltwater, hummed its song across the pasture, and tiny shoots of green broke through the mud. The cattle grew restless, sensing the change, and even the wind carried the sharp, fresh promise of new life. It was on one of these mornings, while mending a section of fence battered by winter, that Clara spoke of her brother. "I had a brother," she began, voice steady but low, as if testing whether the words would hold. "His name was Eli, 2 years younger than me." I paused, the hammer in my hand hovering above the rail. "What happened?" I asked gently. She drew a slow breath. "When fever took our parents, he tried to keep the farm running, but it was too much, too heavy. He left, chasing work upriver. Promised he'd send for me when he could." Her voice cracked, barely noticeable, yet enough to slice through my chest. I never heard from him again. I wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder or take her hand, but something held me back, an instinct that what she needed most was space to let the memory breathe. "I think about him," she continued, eyes on the horizon. "Sometimes I still catch myself imagining what I'd say if he walked up that road tomorrow." For a moment, silence settled around us, not heavy but respectful, like the earth holding its breath. "I'd tell him I'm all right," she whispered, "that I found a place that feels like home." The words hung between us, delicate and brave, and though she didn't say it outright, I felt the truth buried within them, that this ranch, these fences, this quiet life we shared it, had become her home because we had built it together. Later that day, as we worked side by side, I told her about my mother's voice, how she'd sing old ballads while kneading bread, and how her laughter could fill a room. I hadn't spoken of it in years, not even to myself, yet with Clara the words felt safe, like releasing something I'd carried too long. She listened, truly listened, her gaze steady and warm. When I finished, she simply said, "She'd be proud of you." The words struck deeper than I expected, and I had to turn away for a moment, the air catching in my chest. Nights, too, had changed. We no longer sat across the hearth, like strangers guarding unspoken thoughts. Instead, we found ourselves leaning closer, sharing quiet moments that said more than words ever could. One evening after supper, I caught her humming softly by the window, the last of the day's light brushing her hair with gold. I stepped closer, drawn by something I couldn't name. "What is it?" I asked. "A tune my mother taught me," she said. "I forget most of the words, but the melody stays." "Sing it," I whispered before I could stop myself. She hesitated, cheeks coloring. Then, with a breath, she began, voice soft, almost fragile, yet true. The song spoke of rivers and roads, of loss and finding one's way home. And as her voice wove through the room, something shifted inside me, a quiet breaking, like ice giving way to running water. When she finished, the cabin felt different, as if the walls themselves had leaned closer to listen. "You have a beautiful voice," I said. She met my gaze, and for a moment the air felt charged, almost trembling with something we'd both kept hidden. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. As days grew longer, the land demanded more of us. Fences to repair, cattle to move to higher pasture, seeds to sow in stubborn soil. We worked until our hands ached and the sun set in a blaze of red and gold. but it was a shared exhaustion, the kind that left us smiling despite the sweat and mud. One afternoon, rain caught us far from the cabin. We ducked under the wide branches of an old cottonwood, the ground beneath us turning soft and slick. She laughed, truly laughed, head tipped back, rain dripping from her hair. The sound cut through the gray, brighter than any sunbeam. Clara, I murmured, the name feeling different on my tongue, softer, closer. She turned breathless, hair plastered to her face, and before fear could stop me, I reached out, brushing wet strands away, my fingers lingering at her cheek. Her skin was cold from the rain, but her gaze held warmth enough for both of us. I don't know what this is, I whispered, my voice rough, but I know I don't want to lose it. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned into my hand, her eyes closing, breath quick and shallow. For a heartbeat, the world fell away, the rain, the mud, the years of silence and grief. There was only her, the soft press of her cheek against my palm, and the quiet promise that passed between us without a single word. We walked back to the cabin soaked and silent, but something had shifted, undeniable now. The distance we'd kept out of caution, out of fear, had finally begun to close. That night, as we dried by the fire, she looked at me with a gentleness that felt almost like forgiveness. I never thought I'd feel this again, she whispered. Me neither, I admitted. And though neither of us spoke the word aloud, it hung there between us, fragile, terrifying, beautiful. Love. The land was still hard, and the days still long. But now, every sunrise felt different. Not just another day to endure, but another chance to build something that was ours. And as spring painted the plains with new life, I realized the most unexpected truth of all, that sometimes what grows strongest is not what we plant in soil, but what takes root in each other's hearts. The air was thick with the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers that had begun to push stubbornly through the softening ground. Spring was in full bloom, painting the vast plains in colors I'd long forgotten how to appreciate. Yet amid the beauty, a quiet tension had settled over us, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. For weeks, Clara and I had skirted around the edges of what we both felt but neither dared to name. The shared glances, the lingering touches, the silences that hummed with meaning, all threads weaving a fragile web between us. One evening, after a day spent repairing a broken fence that had nearly sent the cattle wandering into the creek, we found ourselves sitting on the porch, shoulders barely touching but close enough to feel the warmth rising between us. The sky was a tapestry of fading oranges and bruised purples, the first stars beginning to prick the dusk. I cleared my throat, the words heavy on my tongue. Clara, there's something I need to say, something I've been holding inside longer than I realized. She turned to me, eyes wide and steady. I'm listening. I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs. When I bought you that day at the auction, I thought I was just paying off a debt, a burden I needed to carry. But it's become so much more. You've become more than that. You're not just someone I protect. You're someone I need. Her breath hitched, and she looked away toward the darkening horizon. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I thought I was broken beyond repair, that no one would ever see me as more than the mistakes I made, the debts I owed. I reached out, gently turning her face toward me. You're not broken, not to me. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, reflecting the stars above. I've been afraid to hope, afraid that opening up would only lead to more pain. Sometimes, I said slowly, the hardest things to face are the ones that can set us free. She let out a shaky breath and finally met my gaze. Caleb, I don't want to lose this, but I'm scared. Scared that what we have isn't enough, or that it won't last. I swallowed the lump in my throat, the weight of her fears anchoring my own. I don't know what the future holds, but I know this: I want you by my side, through every hard winter and every spring that follows. Not out of obligation, but because I love you. The word hung between us, fragile yet fierce. A smile broke across her face, soft and trembling. I love you too. That night, beneath a sky bursting with stars, we crossed the invisible line from two broken souls, merely surviving to two hearts daring to hope, to heal, and to build a life together. The days that followed felt different as if the world itself had shifted on its axis. The ranch, the fields, the endless horizon no longer felt lonely. They felt like home. We worked the land with renewed purpose, sharing dreams once too fragile to voice. We planned an orchard on the northern ridge, the same place my father had once dreamed of planting fruit trees. This time, we would plant and nurture together. On a warm afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, I took Clara's hand and led her to the porch swing. Heart pounding, I knelt before her. I don't want to just share my life with you, Clara. I want to make you my wife. To build a future that's ours. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, voice thick with emotion. Yes, Caleb. Yes, 1,000 times. Yes. As I slid the simple silver band onto her finger, the stars blinked awake above us, bearing silent witness to the beginning of our new chapter. The lonely rancher and the woman who knew his name had found their horizon together. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the endless plains, brushing the sky in soft shades of rose and gold. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and freshly turned earth, a promise whispered by the wind, a new beginning. I stood on the porch, watching Clara tend to the garden we'd planted together, patch of stubborn green defying the wild, arid land. Each leaf, each fragile bloom, was a testament to the resilience we'd found in each other. It had been months since that cold auction day, since the moment I bought a woman wrapped in burlap, not knowing that I was buying my own salvation. The days since then had been hard marked by backbreaking work, the weight of old wounds, and the slow, uncertain weaving of two broken lives into one. But every hardship, every quiet evening by the fire, had brought us closer to something stronger than either of us had dared to hope for. Clara looked up from the soil, her eyes meeting mine with a smile that held a universe of unspoken memories and promises. You know, she said softly, when I first came here, I thought I was just another debt to be paid, something to be endured. I nodded, feeling the ache of those early Dacia silence, my own stubbornness, the distance we both fought to keep. But you showed me, she continued, brushing dirt from her hands, that even broken things can grow, that even the loneliest places can bloom. Her words settled over me like a balm. I reached for her hand, intertwining my fingers with hers, calloused and worn, yet alive with a quiet strength. Together, we turned to face the ranch, the house, the fields, the endless sky stretching beyond the horizon. It was more than land or shelter now. It was a sanctuary born of shared scars and hope. The wedding had been simply a quiet gathering beneath the wide-open sky, the sun dipping low as neighbors and friends from the town came to witness the union of two souls forged by hardship and healed by love. When I slid the ring onto Clara's finger that day, the weight of the moment was heavy, but filled with light, the kind of light that comes only after a long, dark night. Life on the ranch didn't suddenly become easy. The seasons turned as they always had, bringing new challenges and hard work. But we faced them together, no longer as two lonely souls trapped by their past, but as partners ready to build a future. There were mornings when Clara's laughter filled the air as she chased a stray calf, and evenings when we sat side by side on the porch swing, sharing stories and dreams under the vast star-studded sky. One night, as the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, I found myself telling her about my father, the quiet man, who had taught me the value of stubbornness and honor. Clara listened, her hand warm in mine, and I realized how far we'd come from strangers bound by circumstance to two halves of a whole. In that moment, I understood that what we had was more than survival. It was life. It was love. And no matter what storms might come, no matter what the unforgiving West might throw our way, we would face it together. Because sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most enduring endings. Our story was one of loss, and loneliness, yes, but it was also one of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that can form when two broken hearts find their way home. As the sun rose higher, spilling golden light across the fields, I squeezed Clara's hand and smiled. "We've come a long way," I said quietly. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we're just getting started. Under the boundless sky of the American West, two solitary souls had found their horizon not in the vast emptiness around them, but in each other. And that was enough. If you were in his shoes, would you fight the same fight? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like the video. Explore the other videos on your screen and keep the journey going.